Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going deep into the world of givers, takers, and matchers.
Oh, yeah.
Those fascinating ways people approach, interactions and how those approaches affect success. You've given us a really intriguing mix of material for this deep dive.
Yeah.
Excerpts from Adam Grant's book, Give and Take, research studies,
Yep.
and even anecdotes about figures like Abraham Lincoln,
Oh, wow.
Jonas Salk, and Wilt Chamberlain.
It's quite the mix.
It's a lot to unpack, but buckle up because I think we're in for some surprising insights into human nature.
Yeah.
And maybe even some practical tips you can use yourself.
What's fascinating to me is that this isn't just some theoretical framework.
Right.
We have real-world examples, historical figures, and hard data, all pointing towards these patterns of giving, taking, and matching.
Grant's book, Give and Take, really lays the groundwork here.
Yeah.
Can you remind us about these core personality types, givers, takers, and matchers?
Givers are the folks who genuinely enjoy contributing to others. They're always willing to lend a hand, share their knowledge, and go the extra mile without expecting anything in return.
Then we have the takers, who seem to be laser-focused on their own gain, sometimes even at the expense of others, right?
That's right. Takers excel at self-promotion and often disguise their self-serving motives.
Right.
They're all about climbing the ladder,
Yeah.
even if they have to step on a few fingers along the way.
And matchers, they're somewhere in between, I guess.
Matchers value fairness and balance.
Yeah.
They operate on a you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours principle.
Oh, okay.
If they do you a favor, they expect one in return. It's all about maintaining an equal exchange.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It's interesting, though. Grant's research found that givers are often found at both the top and the bottom of the success ladder.
Yeah.
It's not as simple as nice guys finish last, is it?
Not at all.
Yeah.
It's way more nuanced than that.
Yeah.
The question is, what are the factors that tip the scales?
Right.
What makes the difference between giving, leading to success, or becoming a path to failure?
Okay, so let's dive into some of these real-life examples from the material you've brought.
Sure.
I'm especially curious about those givers who landed at the bottom of the ladder.
Okay.
Like that venture capitalist, David Hornick.
Yes,
It seems like offering to fund a company would be a good thing, right?
you'd think so. But in Hornick's case, his generosity actually backfired.
Really?
He offered to fund Danny Shader's company and even gave Shader a list of references, all singing Hornick's praises.
So he did everything right.
Right.
Why did Shader turn him down?
Shader actually worried that Hornick might be too nice.
Oh, wow.
He was afraid that Hornick's kindness would translate into a lack of tough love in the boardroom.
Hmm.
Shader ended going with another investor who had a reputation for being a bit more hard-nosed.
Wow. So being too nice can actually be a liability in some cases.
It can.
You also mentioned a politician, Richard Sampson. He seems like another example of generosity backfiring.
Absolutely. Sampson had a genuine chance of winning a Senate seat, but he stepped aside and let his rival, Lyman Trumbull, run instead.
Okay, now that's just crazy.
Yeah.
Were they close friends or something?
Not at all. They were on opposite sides of the political spectrum.
Wow.
Sampson believed that Trumbull was a better advocate for a cause they both cared about, so he willingly sacrificed his own ambition for what he thought was the greater good.
Huh.
Sadly for him, it cost him the election.
Those are both such clear illustrations of how a giver's tendency to put others first can backfire.
Right.
It almost feels like playing it safe and being a matcher might be the best approach.
You might think so?
But then we also have those amazing stories about givers like Abraham Lincoln achieving incredible success.
Yes.
Didn't he actually invite his rivals into his cabinet?
He did.
That's a wild move.
It was. Most people would want to surround themselves with allies, but Lincoln saw things differently.
Right.
He understood that to solve the enormous challenges facing the country, he needed the best minds available, regardless of their political leanings.
So he basically prioritized the good of the nation over his own ego and potential political maneuvering.
Exactly. His rivals initially gave him a hard time, but eventually they all came to respect him deeply. Lincoln's willingness to include them, even after they'd opposed him, actually strengthened his leadership.
Wow.
It's a testament to how giving, even in the face of opposition, can lead to more influence in the long run.
That's such a powerful story. We also have someone like Adam Rifkin, considered one of the best networkers in America.
Oh, yeah.
He managed to connect with the founders of companies like Facebook and Twitter.
Incredible networker.
It sounds like he used a very giver approach to build those connections.
He did. Rifkin focused on helping others, offering advice, making introductions, and sharing his knowledge freely without expecting anything in return.
Hmm.
This approach earned him a reputation as a genuinely helpful person, and that opened doors to incredible connections and opportunities.
So it really does seem like giving can be an incredible engine for success.
Yeah,
It even turns that whole nice guys finish last thing on its head.
totally.
We also have the story of George Meyer, a writer for The Simpsons. Didn't he take on a lot of behind-the-scenes tasks that didn't get him a ton of personal recognition?
He did.
Hmm.
Meyer often took on tasks like rewriting jokes or polishing other people's work, even though those tasks didn't always put him in the spotlight.
Mm,
But his willingness to contribute to the success of the show as a whole earned him a ton of respect from his colleagues.
right.
It also contributed to The Simpsons' legendary success, which in turn boosted his own career.
That's a fantastic example of how a giver's mindset can ultimately benefit everyone involved. It's clear that givers can achieve some amazing things.
Yeah.
But you mentioned earlier that givers are also often found at the bottom of the success ladder. Right. It leads to those less favorable outcomes.
Yeah.
It seems like there's a fine line between being a successful giver and, well, getting taken advantage of.
There is.
Yeah.
And that brings us to the difference between what Grant calls selfless giving and otherish giving.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Break that down for me. Selfless versus otherish giving. What's the difference?
Think of selfless givers as those who constantly prioritize the needs of others,
Okay.
often at the expense of their own well-being.
Mm-hmm.
They give without setting boundaries, which can lead to exhaustion, resentment,
Yeah.
and sometimes even exploitation.
So they're almost too giving for their own good. Like they end up burning themselves out.
Exactly. Their generosity becomes unsustainable. And unfortunately, their efforts often go unnoticed or unappreciated.
Whereas otherish givers find a way to strike a balance. They're still generous and helpful, but they also look out for their own interests.
Right. Otherish givers are strategic.
Okay.
They set boundaries, prioritize their own well-being, and make sure their giving is both sustainable and impactful. It's about being generous without becoming a doormat.
This reminds me of that story about Lillian Bauer, the consultant whose generosity actually seemed to hold her back in her career.
Lillian's story is a classic example of selfless giving gone wrong.
Really?
She was incredibly talented and hardworking, but she couldn't say no to anyone.
Oh, wow.
She'd mentor junior colleagues, help with business school applications, and go above and beyond for clients.
So it sounds like she was the ideal employee, always willing to help. Where did things go wrong?
The problem was that her colleagues started to see her as a pushover.
Oh.
Clients took advantage of her willingness to bend over backward.
Mm.
And when it came time for promotions, she was consistently overlooked.
Wow.
All that giving actually prevented her from reaching her full potential.
That's such a shame. It seems like her intentions were good, but it ultimately backfired.
And research backs this up.
Does it?
Studies show that selfless givers are often overlooked for promotions, earn less money, and experience higher levels of stress and burnout. It's a real problem.
So what are some of the traps that selfless givers fall into? What should we be looking out for?
One common trap is being too trusting. They assume that everyone has good intentions, which can leave them vulnerable to takers who are always looking for opportunities to exploit someone's kindness.
That's like the story of Peter Audit and his Christmas bonus. His
Yeah.
boss promised him a huge bonus, but instead gave him a measly fruit basket.
Exactly. It's a perfect example of a taker taking advantage of a giver.
Right.
And then there's the empathy trap. Selfless givers can be so focused on other people's feelings that they have trouble setting boundaries. They end up giving away too much of their time, energy, or even money.
I can see how that would play out in negotiations where a selfless giver might agree to a deal that's not really in their best interest just to avoid conflict or make the other person happy.
You're absolutely right. They end up prioritizing the other person's feelings over their own needs, which can have some pretty negative consequences in the long run. And then there's the trap of being too timid. Selfless givers often struggle to advocate for themselves or push back against unfair requests.
Yeah.
They become doormats, letting others walk all over them.
You know, that reminds me of when I was selling ads for Let's Go. I was such a pushover. I was so afraid of confrontation that I'd agree to anything just to avoid making waves. It took me a while to learn how to stand up for myself and my work.
It's a common experience for givers. They're often conflict-averse and struggle to assert themselves, even when it's in their best interest to do so. But the good news is that otherish givers have figured out how to navigate these tricky situations. They manage to be generous without getting burned out or taken advantage of.
Okay, so how do they do it? What are some strategies that otherish givers use?
One key strategy is something called sincerity screening. It's basically a way of figuring out whether someone is a giver, taker, or matcher before investing too much time and energy in them.
So it's like being a social detective trying to figure out someone's true motives.
Yeah.
But isn't that a bit, well, cynical?
I understand your hesitation, but think of it as being discerning. Other rich givers are simply paying attention to cues that reveal a person's true reciprocity style.
Okay.
They observe how someone interacts with others, how they talk about their accomplishments, and how they respond to requests for help.
So they're not just blindly trusting everyone. They're being selective about who they choose to help.
Exactly. It's about investing their energy in relationships that are likely to be mutually beneficial
Right.
and avoiding those that could lead to exploitation. Another important strategy is perspective taking.
Okay.
It's about being able to understand the other person's point of view.
So it's not just about having empathy. It's about really understanding the other person's interests and motivation.
Right. And it's about finding creative solutions that benefit both sides.
Oh.
Instead of just giving in to demands or trying to please everyone, otherish givers look for ways to align their own interests with the interests of others.
It's about creating win-win situations where everyone walks away feeling satisfied.
Absolutely. This is especially important in negotiations. Otherish givers can use perspective taking to reach agreements that create value for both parties. It's about expanding the pie, so to
Yeah.
speak, rather than just fighting over the crumbs.
And another important skill for otherish givers is advocating for others. They're often very good at championing the needs of those around them.
They are.
But you mentioned that selfless givers often struggle to advocate for themselves.
Right.
How can they leverage this skill to become more successful?
They can frame their own needs in terms of supporting others. We see this in the story of Samir, who was trying to negotiate a better deal for himself. Instead of focusing on his own personal gain, he framed his request as a way to better provide for his family.
So he basically turned his personal needs into a way of helping others.
Exactly. And it worked.
Did it?
His request was met with much more understanding and support than if he just focused on himself. It's a great example of how even assertive communication can be aligned with giver values.
We've talked a lot about individual giving, but how do these ideas apply to groups and organizations?
Right.
Can you really create a culture that promotes giving and discourages taking?
That's where things get really interesting.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what we'll dive into after the break.
So we've been talking about individual givers and takers, but I'm curious how this all plays out on a larger scale.
Yeah.
Can you really create a culture that encourages giving and makes it harder for takers to, take?
Right.
You mentioned something called Free Cycle before the break.
Yeah.
What is that?
Free Cycle is a global network where people can give away unwanted items for free.
Okay.
It's all about finding new homes for things that might otherwise end up in a landfill.
So it's like a giant online giveaway.
It is.
But wouldn't that just be a free-for-all for takers to snag everything without giving back?
That's a good question.
Mm.
But research suggests that even people who lean towards being takers will participate in systems like Free Cycle. You see, it's often more convenient for them to give something away than to dispose of it themselves.
Right.
Their self-interest actually aligns with the giving behavior.
So their own laziness, so to speak, ends up benefiting someone else.
Pretty much. But here's what's even more interesting. Once people start giving, even if it's for selfish reasons, they often experience a shift in perspective.
Oh, really?
They start to see the positive impact they're having on others.
Okay.
And that can lead to a more genuine desire to contribute.
It's like giving becomes contagious.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
There's another fascinating system that demonstrates this even more clearly. It's called the reciprocity ring.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me more about the reciprocity ring. What is it?
Imagine a group of people coming together, and each person makes a request for something they need.
Okay.
It could be career advice, help with a project, or even something as simple as a recommendation for a good restaurant.
So that actually sounds kind of fun. What happens next?
Everyone in the group looks for ways to fulfill the requests using their own skills, knowledge, or connections.
Okay.
So you might be able to help someone find a job, while someone else might be able to give you feedback on a presentation.
It sounds like a structured way to encourage giving and connect people who can help each other.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what's remarkable is that even in groups with a mix of givers, takers, and matchers, the reciprocity ring tends to spark a surprising amount of giving.
Why do you think that is?
One key factor is that the giving becomes public. Everyone can see who's contributing and who's holding back. It creates a bit of a reputational incentive to participate.
Ah, so takers don't want to be seen as selfish or unhelpful, especially when everyone else is pitching in.
Right. And this principle isn't limited to these specific exercises.
Right.
It applies when you create a culture that celebrates and rewards giving. You create an environment where everyone feels encouraged to contribute, regardless of their natural tendencies.
So how do you actually build that kind of culture? How do you make giving the norm?
It starts with recognizing and rewarding giving behaviors.
Okay.
Something as simple as publicly acknowledging someone who went above and beyond to help a colleague can go a long way.
Or celebrating team successes that were driven by collaboration and a spirit of generosity.
Exactly. You could also encourage people to share their skills and knowledge through mentoring programs or knowledge-sharing platforms.
Mhm.
And perhaps most importantly, leaders need to model giving behavior themselves.
That makes sense. If a company's leaders are constantly taking credit, hoarding resources, or taking advantage of others, that's going to send a pretty clear message that that's the way to succeed.
Right. But if leaders are generous with their time, knowledge, and resources, it creates a ripple effect throughout the organization.
Yeah.
It sets the tone that giving is valued and rewarded. It makes people feel safe to contribute and help each other succeed.
This has been such an insightful conversation.
Yeah.
So what does it all mean? What's the takeaway for our listener today?
Well, I think the big takeaway is that understanding the different ways people approach reciprocity, whether they're givers, takers, or matchers, can be incredibly powerful.
Right.
It can help you build stronger relationships, achieve greater success,
Mhm.
and even create a more giving culture in your own workplace.
And it's important to remember that most of us aren't just one type or the other.
Right.
We all have a mix of giver, taker, and matcher tendencies within us. But we can be more conscious about expressing those giver values.
That's a great point. The challenge is to find that balance, to be generous without being taken advantage of, to protect yourself without shutting yourself off from opportunities to contribute.
Right.
And to remember that giving, when done thoughtfully and strategically, can be an incredibly powerful force for good for yourself and for those around you.
Well, I don't know about you, but I'm feeling inspired to go out and do some good in the world. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of giving, taking, and matching.
My pleasure.
And remember, giving doesn't have to be a grand gesture. It can be as simple as offering a helping hand to a colleague or sharing your knowledge with someone who needs it.
I completely agree. Every act of giving, no matter how small, can make a difference.
Until next time, keep learning, keep giving, and keep diving